Before we begin implementing Java server pages, I wanted to talk a little bit about what they are, what their architecture is, and how they get processed by a web server. So Java server pages, JSP for short, are an extension of Java servlets. They're used for developing web pages that have dynamic content. And when I say dynamic content, I mean things like web pages that collect input from users via forms, web pages that present records from a database, web pages that share information, web pages that send emails, or web pages that upload files. Those are all examples of dynamic content. Java server pages are a server-side scripting language very similar to ASP or PHP. A JSP is nothing more than a text file that has a .JSP extension, but inside of the text file there's a mixture of HTML and embedded Java code. This is an example of a JSP. We have a mixture of HTML and Java code. Okay. The HTML manages the display of the page, and the Java code handles all of the page logic. So this is an example of a JSP. Now it's important to note that all of the Java code, it has to go between special tags. The less than symbol with the percent is the start tag for a JSP element, and that start tag ends with the percent and then the greater than symbol. Okay, so it's the start tag and the end tag for a JSP element, and in between those tags is the Java code, okay, that's responsible for the logic, okay, of the page. Okay, so very important to note, anywhere where you want to include Java code, you have to start it off with the start tag for a JSP and the end tag for a JSP. Okay, so it's a mixture of HTML elements and JSP elements. Now within this JSP page we can also include things like JavaScript, we can also include things like CSS, okay, and eventually we will. Okay, but this is an example of a JSP that contains just HTML and JSP elements. Okay, so a little bit about the architecture. To process JSP pages, a web server needs two things: a JSP container and a servlet engine. The JSP container is responsible for intercepting requests for JSP pages. It works with the web server to provide the runtime environment and other services that a JSP needs. It understands those special JSP elements, okay, that are part of a JSP. Now, in just a few moments, we're going to talk about what the servlet engine does when we talk about how a JSP is processed, okay? But suffice to say, the Apache web server and the Glassfish web server, they have a built-in JSP container and a servlet engine. We're going to be using the Glassfish web server. Okay, and this diagram illustrates a typical JSP architecture, okay, where we have our clients. And by the way, in the case of a JSP, our client is a web browser, right? Because a JSP is a web page. So our client is actually a web browser. Okay, it issues an HTTP request via the internet to a JSP page, okay, which is going to be residing on some web server. Okay, and that web server is going to have a JSP container and a servlet engine, and then there's some processing that takes place that we're going to talk about in just a minute. There's some processing that takes place on the web server, okay, and the processing may or may not involve the interaction with the database, okay, but after the processing has taken place, an HTTP response is sent back over the internet to our web browser, okay. So let's talk in more detail about this processing that takes place on the web server, because it's really very interesting, okay. So the first step is that a browser sends an HTTP request to a web server, and the web server recognizes that the HTTP request is for a JSP page because it sees the .JSP extension in the file name. Okay, so once the web server recognizes that the request is for a JSP page, it forwards the request to the JSP container. The JSP container then loads the JSP, but also it converts it into a servlet. Remember I said that JSPs are an extension of Java servlets? Well, Java servlets are still used in the technology. The JSP container converts the JSP into a servlet. In the conversion, all of that HTML is converted to out.write statements. And the JSP elements that contain the Java code, they're converted to Java code. Okay. Next, the JSP container compiles the servlet into an executable class, and it forwards it to the servlet engine. Okay. The servlet engine, it loads the servlet class, and then it executes it. During the execution, the servlet produces an output in HTML format. It produces HTML, which the servlet engine passes back to the web server inside of an HTTP response. The web server then sends the HTTP response back to the browser in the form of static HTML. The web browser then dynamically generates the HTML page inside the HTTP response, exactly as if it were a static HTML page. Okay, so if we go back and we take a look at our original JSP, okay, that we took a look at a few slides back, okay, it contains a mixture of HTML and Java code, and the Java code has to be embedded within JSP elements. So here's our JSP. Well, that JSP, it gets converted with a JSP container into a Java servlet. And this is an example. This is what that JSP that we were just looking at on the previous slide, that's what it would look like. This is what it would look like as a Java servlet. You can see there's a bunch of out.write statements that contain HTML code. It contains the raw Java code that had previously been included within the JSP elements. Okay, and there's some more out.write statements. Okay, this is just a part of the Java servlet, but it's the important part of the Java servlet. Okay, well, this Java servlet, it gets compiled and then it gets executed by the servlet engine. And what does it produce? This servlet produces nothing more than static HTML. This, what you're looking at now, is the output of the servlet, and it's nothing more than static HTML. Well, this static HTML gets wrapped up in an HTTP response, and it gets sent back to the web browser, and then the web browser renders it just like it would render a static HTML page, and this is what we would see in the browser. So it's some pretty interesting processing that takes place. In just a few minutes, we're going to hop out into NetBeans and we're going to do some coding. Okay, but before we do so, I wanted to go to the NetBeans website, where the web page where you can go to download NetBeans, because all of this development, all of our JSP development inside of NetBeans assumes that you have installed either the Java EE NetBeans bundle or the Java All bundle. I always install the the All bundle. Okay, but at a minimum, you would have to have installed the Java EE bundle of NetBeans for any of this to work, to implement JSPs. Okay, so just want to make sure that everybody is clear on that. Okay, so let's go out into NetBeans next. Okay, and let's implement that date JSP web application that we took a look at in the PowerPoint presentation. So to create a JSP web application in NetBeans, we're going to go up to the File drop-down option. We're going to select New Project, and underneath the categories, we're going to select Java Web. Underneath the projects, we're going to select Web Application. So you're going to make sure you select Java Web underneath of Categories and Web Application underneath of Projects. Push on Next and give your web application a name. I'm going to name this web application Date Web Application. Okay, I'm going to push on Next. And in this window, we don't have to make any changes, but we are going to be using Glassfish as our server, so I wanted to point that out. And we're also going to be using the 7th edition of the Java EE API. By the way, EE stands for Enterprise Edition. And in the Java EE API, there are a number of classes that we'll be using specifically geared towards JSP development, JSF development, Java Bean development, but nonetheless we're going to be using the 7th edition of the Java EE API. So no changes really need to be made in here, but I just wanted to point out our server and the Java EE version we're going to be using. And there's nothing that needs to be done in the frameworks window either. We're not going to be using Java server faces or struts or Hibernate or Spring. So we'll just push on finish, and NetBeans is going to generate our web application project for us, and we can see it over in the projects tab. Okay, date web application, and it automatically generates an index.html file for us, but we're not going to be using that in just a few moments. We're going to be deleting that. But it automatically builds an HTML file for us. What we're going to do next is we're going to add a JSP. We're going to be implementing JSP pages, not HTML pages. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a JSP to this project. So select the project, do a right click, select new, and then go down to other. And underneath of categories, make sure you select web, and then underneath of file types, make sure you select JSP. Okay, and then push on next. Give your JSP a name like index, okay, and then push on finish, and NetBeans will generate a JSP page for you, which you can see is loaded in the code editor. Right now it really contains nothing but HTML. In a few moments we'll be adding some JSP elements to it, and you can also see it over in the projects tab. We can also delete that HTML file. We're not going to be using it. There's no point to keep it there in our project, so I typically delete it. Okay, but now what we're going to do is we're going to make some updates to this JSP page. And first of all, we're just going to update, make some simple updates to the title and the heading 1 elements of the page. Okay, we're going to change the title of the page to today's date, and we're going to change the heading 1 element so that it displays today's date as well. Okay, so some simple changes to the static HTML in the page. Now what we're going to do is we're going to begin including some JSP elements. We're going to begin including some Java code. And the first thing we want to do is we want to import the date class, okay, because we're going to be creating a date object. Okay, so to import the date class is very similar. To import the date class into a JSP is very similar to the way that you would do it in a Java class, a plain old Java class. You have to import it. Okay, so at the top of the file, first of all though, you want to make sure you include your start tag and your end tag for your JSP element. Okay, there they are. There's the start tag and the end tag. And in the case of an import statement, I also have to include an annotation, an @page annotation. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a class. So I'm going to start off by selecting the keyword import. Okay, and then the class that I'm going to import is the Java, okay, .util. You can see NetBeans is helping me out here. Okay, date class. Okay, so I want to import that class. Okay, and it's giving me an error, so let me just see if I can compile the code and maybe the error will go away. Okay, and it did. I don't know why that happens, but sometimes when you're implementing Java code within JSP elements, you might see an error like that, a red squiggly. But if you simply compile your code, oftentimes that error will go away. Okay, but I've imported the date class at the top of the file. Okay, so now I want to use it. I want to use it in a JSP element. I want to use it in some Java code. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down below the head HTML element, and I'm going to include my start and my end JSP tags, because I'm going to include some Java code down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object of the date class named date. And by the way, this object is going to have a default date of today's date. Okay. So anyway, there's my JSP element, some Java code I've embedded right within the HTML of this JSP page. Well, I'm not done yet. I want to include some more, okay, information in this JSP page. Below the heading 1 element, I'm going to include a paragraph. I'm going to include a paragraph. Okay. And inside of the paragraph, I'm going to contain a mixture of just plain old text. Today's date is, but then I'm going to include some more Java code. So it has to go within a JSP element. So there's my start tag and my end tag for my JSP element. And what I want to include, the Java code that I want to include in here is nothing more than the current value that's in my date object, which we know is going to be today's date. Okay, so I'm going to include an equal sign, and then I'm going to reference my variable date. Okay? So there's my JSP, a mixture of HTML, okay, and Java code embedded within JSP elements. What I'm going to do, I'm going to compile this code just like I would compile a Java file. I'm going to select it over in the Projects tab, do a right click, and compile the file. And then I'm going to run it. Okay, and a bunch of stuff is going to happen when I run this JSP. First of all, NetBeans is going to start up Glassfish, our web server. It's going to start it up, so it's going to take a little while. Okay, and then it's automatically going to load the JSP in my default web browser, which happens to be IE. Your default web browser might not be IE, mine is. So we're going to see IE pop up, and this JSP is going to be rendered in that browser. So let's do that. Let's run the file. We've compiled it. We got a successful build. Let's run the file. So select the JSP, do a right click, and then select Run File. Okay. It's going to take a little while. Down in the output area, if you select on the Glassfish server tab, you're going to see a bunch of stuff being output. Well, this is Glassfish. This is the web server starting up. Okay, and it's going to take a little while, so don't panic. Okay, let it do its thing. But in just a few seconds, we're going to see IE flashing. There it is. It's flashing. Well, that's because the JSP has been rendered in the browser. Okay, and there's the JSP. There you can see index.jsp. Okay, now the really interesting thing I want to illustrate right now, I'm going to go back into NetBeans. Okay, I want to make a round trip with this. Here's the JSP, right, that we started with, that we coded. Okay, mixture of HTML and JSP elements that have embedded Java code. Remember I said what happens on the web server, okay, is that the JSP container, it converts this JSP into what? A servlet. We can take a look at that servlet. We select the JSP, do a right click, there's an option to view the servlet. Let's select that. Here's the servlet that gets generated. It's got a bunch of stuff at the top, which I'm not too worried about. What I want to do is I want to scroll down a little bit, because this to me is the important part. Look at all the out.write statements. Okay? These are the statements that are going to generate the HTML that was in the JSP. If I go back to the JSP, you know, there's the HTML element, the head element, the meta element, the title element. Well, for every one of those elements, you see an out.write statement. Okay? But then, here's the pure Java code that was embedded within the JSP element, okay, in the servlet. It's going to get executed. Okay, so here's our servlet. So this servlet, okay, gets compiled by the servlet engine, and then it gets executed. And the output of this servlet, I'm going to go back into the web browser, the output of this servlet is pure HTML, is this. The servlet that we were taking a look at in NetBeans generated this static HTML. Sent it back to the web browser, IE in my case, and the web browser rendered it as you see it. Okay, so that's JSP implementation in NetBeans, a little bit about the JSP architecture and how JSPs are processed by the web server.